Well, the last time I was talking to you, I was speaking from Hebrews 10, but I ran out of time and it was a bit difficult to complete the chapter, so I will touch on a little bit of it, although mainly I'm into Hebrews 11. Anyway, let me just briefly go back to verse 22, actually, because here it's simply saying, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith. What he's really saying is that we can draw near to the Lord in fellowship, and he's exhorting them to do that in faith that we have been cleansed from sin. And then in verse 23, he puts it, let's hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering. By the way, I am using the King James Version today. So there's very much a question of, one point is that because our sin is cleansed, we can draw near to the Lord. And then secondly, in verse 23, that we should hold fast to this faith that we have in salvation, and that we shouldn't vary, we shouldn't weary. You know, there's a danger that some people, when they first know the Lord, are full of excitement and fire, and then it all drifts away. It shouldn't. We should keep that experience. And then he does go on further towards the end of the chapter, and then I'll move on to 11, where he says in verse 35, don't throw away your confidence, because it's that confidence in our relationship with Christ and with God the Father that gives us the access to rewards. And it says in verse 36, you have need of patience, that after you've done the will of God, you might receive the promise. And the promise, of course, is our position in God's coming kingdom. And then he says for a little while, and he that shall come will come. And there will be a certain point at which he will not delay. I do believe that we're getting to that point in our prophetic view of history at the moment. So then he turns basically in chapter 11 to the subject which is going to probably take the next two messages, because Hebrews 11 to me is possibly the most important chapter here in this book, and the one that appeals to me most because, as you know, I endeavour to live by faith. And even when I came out of the prison, because that was a manifestation of very great faith, praying for my release and then experiencing it with the Prime Minister, people said to me, even then, that I was a man of faith, that only God can finally judge. But here, Paul looks at faith in a slightly different way. This is not just faith in salvation. It is faith is the substance of things we hope for. So this faith is faith in the practical sense in our lives, as opposed to what we've looked at previously, which is faith for salvation. So Paul is saying very definitely that faith becomes substance and evidence of things that we haven't seen. Now, this is a very strong issue, certainly is in my life, and certainly should be in all our lives, linked with our prayer, if the faith that we have becomes more than just something, how can I put it, something which is theoretical, and here faith becomes something which is practical. You see, to many people, faith is not a fact, it is a fancy. People say, I hope so, I think so, I believe so. But usually when they're saying that, it is not an evidence of real faith. It is hope. And there's nothing more. It's not fact. Whereas what Paul is trying to do is take faith away from that concept and say faith should be and is, to the believer, faith is the substance of what you hope for and the evidence of what you hope for and haven't seen. So faith is looking into the future and believing that you will get what you speak. And because of this, he says in verse 2, the elders obtained a good report, and I think that's a reference particularly to the 12 spies that were sent out. As you know, when under Moses, the children of Israel reached the borders of the promised land after 40 days, sent 12 spies in who came back with a very varied report. 10 of them, well, all 12 said it's a land flowing with milk and honey. It's everything that God had promised us. But 10 said we can't do it because there are giants there and vast armies. Only 2 said, with God nothing is impossible, let's go in. But because the people followed the majority, the result was they actually spent another 40 years in the wilderness. That for many of them was a lifetime. And it is suggested that only 2 of the original group lived, and I'm assuming that was the adults, that lived to the final entry when it was Joshua and Caleb.